Well, it's the next day, and I went and got me some mahogany planks. There's a hardwood store not too far from us, so I bought these. They're 7/16 of an inch thick mahogany planks, tongue and grooved. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and pull the pieces out of the. I'm going to open the deck back up where I cut it yesterday, and I'm going to pull all the small pieces out. I had a lot of debate over what the best way was to do this. You know, I kind of considered, should I leave these planks long, and let's say I have a 4.5 foot section here, should I have 4.5 foot sections of this plank and actually tongue and groove them together? Because this is only 1/2 inch thick, you can see there's some flex to this wood. And what I decided to do instead is I'm going to cut this down into about 10 to 12 inch long pieces, and I'm going to leave slight gaps between them, almost like if you were laying tile. And my reason for this is I believe that when I pour the epoxy down between them, it's going to help to secure all these ends together. And more importantly, it's going to form more bonds to hold the inner skin and the outer skin together in those particular places. So I don't know if that's the right thinking or not. It just happens to be the thinking I'm going with. I'm going to put these aside and open the bottom of the deck back up and start getting these pieces pulled out of here. Interestingly enough, these few screws are really long, and I went down below and looked, and so we have the fiberglass, we have the core, we have another layer of fiberglass, and then down below there's a gap, an air gap, and then there's a decorative ceiling there in the salon. A couple of these screws go all the way through both layers of this deck, through the core, and into a set of horizontal beams that attaches to the ceiling. Now, I'm taking them out on this side, and it's not making anything at all loose down below. I've checked it a dozen times just to make sure, but that's what these are. And you'll notice they're about 3 inches long. These are the ones that I could see light through. Well, not that one. That one broke off. Again, not unlike the other one. These are all bronze wood screws. Sure how well you can see this, but there's a fiberglass patch here and an epoxy patch here. I believe this is where there were some original openings through the deck for the propane locker. Yeah, this piece you can get. There's another one of the bolts that went through to hold on that dock box, and those were definitely the water intrusion spots. Looking at this, I can tell that's where it was wet. Yeah, that piece was in there pretty good. I don't know if the camera's picking this. I'm pushing this with my finger. Water's coming out as if it's like a sponge. Clearly, that one's not in good shape. I think the ideal situation would be to just rip all this up at one shot, put all the wood down, and then epoxy over all the wood at one time. But it's so hard to do, given that I'm not in a enclosed area. Don't necessarily have the time to sit and do all this in one setting, so it's probably going to be harder this way. But I think what I'm going to do is patch up to a point. Let's say, for example, I run a small piece of divider right here, and I fill all the rest of this in with epoxy and fiberglass, leave this small section open and just cover that. And as I start working my way there, I'll do it in 3 or 4 foot sections at a time. So I have a fine brand dust collector here that I'm going to be using for this. This is one of these crawfish plates for when you do a crawfish boil. I basically just cut the section of it off, drill the hole in it to apply the vacuum, and if I keep this just to the right of where I'm actually grinding, it throws most of it in there, sucks it up into the vacuum. It's a great solution if you don't have a complete containment system. We also don't happen to live in an area where you have to recapture all of that, so I just want to keep it nice and neat, keep the dust from going all over my boat, my neighbor's boats. So now that we've finished grinding down the really high spots, I'm just going to take a light 150 grit sandpaper, and I'm just going to smooth this and get any of these wood fibers off of here before I wipe it down with acetone. That's not gritty enough. I'm going to go down to 100. As a woodworker, I always forget that this is not quite the same.
So as I worked with this orbital palm sander, I realized that this was going to take quite a long time. So I went ahead and switched to something else. I didn't want to go all the way to the grinding wheel, but I needed something that had a better grit, a more coarse grit. So I have this old belt sander that I bought just for this task, and it has a 36 grit belt on it. That worked well. So the next step was to go ahead and cut all the pieces and get them lined up for placing in the deck. So as I cut each piece, I try to leave a slight gap between each one, and you can kind of see how this wood pattern starts to curve a little bit along the edge of the deck. Using straight planks would not have made this as possible, and since there was hardwood in the deck already, I really wanted to go forward with hardwood again rather than plywood. So that's what you're seeing here. So while I'm cutting these up, Deb's starting to label those so we can pull them all out, and when we get ready to epoxy them down to the lower skin of the fiberglass deck, we'll know what order to put them in. So once all the labeled boards were pulled back up, we cleaned this whole surface with acetone.
Not being a guy who's done a lot of epoxy, and I'm starting with a fairly small batch, I'll probably end up having to mix more of this just to get a first base coat down on this surface. And what I'm doing is I'm painting one base coat down on this deck, and then I'm going to create a thickened epoxy, and I'm going to use that to adhere the wood down to it.
So through the miracle of time, we have the first coat down. And again, I wanted to do this to put a good solid seal along this and really give it a good smooth place to start to adhere the thickened buttered epoxy that we'll use to glue the boards down. So I continue to work in small batches. I'm using a small tub, as you can see here, and I'm mixing about 10 to 14 pumps of resin and 10 to 14 pumps of hardener in there. I wanted to get this to what they refer to as a peanut butter consistency, but you can see it's actually a little bit thinner than that. I think the different consistencies that West references is ketchup, mayonnaise, and peanut butter. This looks a little bit more like a ketchup to mayonnaise consistency, so I probably could have made this a bit thicker. But what I'm doing is I'm using a plastic spreader, and it has a little V notches cut in one side of it, a lot like laying tile if you've ever done that. So it gives myself a good bond there, and it spreads it at the correct thickness throughout all of it. Now again, starting in a small section here, making sure I have good coverage, and just spreading it out to the point where I'll be able to put the boards in place. And this is the first time I'm doing this, so you can see I'm working pretty slow and trying to get a feel for exactly the best way to do it, but you can see the consistency as this pours out. My peanut butter doesn't come out of the jar that way, so I think next batch as I'm mixing this, I start to mix a little bit thicker. makes it a little bit easier to work with that way. And you can see now it's just a matter of starting to lay the pieces of wood down in place. And again, I'm working with a really small section. What I don't want to do is rush this and have the resin start to kick and potentially put me in a position where it doesn't cure well. I did buy the extra slow bonding epoxy, and I thought that would really help me out, especially given that I'm a beginner here. I did not want to risk having the epoxy set up. So this extra slow hardening time gives me between 25 and 35 minutes before it pots up, or it's pot like this, so before it gets hardened up. So anyway, there's going to be plenty of time to sort of work with, and even in cases like this where I needed to add a little bit more epoxy, peanut butter down below, just because the board was a little bit longer than I had initially anticipated when I first spread it out. It was plenty to work with here. So we'll just continue this process until we fill the opening here. And like most jobs, as Deb and I move forward on it, we find our groove, and we started working well together, where I was spreading the thickened epoxy down and she was placing the puzzle pieces back in place in the numbered order she set up. When we had all the boards laid down, I then went ahead and cleaned up the surface. I was basically just scraping up any spots that had sort of oozed up a little bit, or where we had dropped a little bit of the peanut butter. This video clip is the next morning, but what I wanted to show is where we used the thickened epoxy and we spread it across all of those boards to essentially get one smooth layer. We didn't want to have, obviously, an uneven surface when we get ready to start applying fiberglass to this. So I'm not sure if you can see it, but it's all been smoothed over, and then we ground about a 3 or 4 inch edge around the opening as well, and got that all the way down to bare fiberglass so that we can adhere the new epoxy and fiberglass overlapping the existing, so it becomes one piece of integral deck. Join us next week as we start the fiberglass layup, building up the thickness of the deck over our repaired patch area. We also have some serious thoughts on what the right way is to actually do this repair. I'm not 100% thrilled with this particular one, and we have a bit of crisis of decision here where we contemplate pulling up the deck and or redoing the whole thing.
Hey everybody, thanks for watching, and please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or even Tumblr. Please take a moment and go over to our website at svdreamchaser.com to download free resources for cruising and how-to projects. Get your thumbs and mouses ready. We also have a couple of links right on the screen for some other playlists and videos that we think you'll enjoy. Thanks for watching, fellow dreamers.